This meeting is being held in accordance with notice published in the Federal Register on April 8, 2024. The agenda for the meeting was announced in this notice, and a more detailed agenda is posted on the FAA's CompStack website. As DFO, it is my responsibility to ensure the agenda is followed and that accurate minutes are kept. I also have the responsibility to adjourn the meeting, should I find it necessary in the public interest to do so. Only CompStack members may participate in any discussions and vote on matters put to a vote by the chair. I'd like to thank our chair, vice chair, and CompStack members for their hard work and dedication to helping FAA enable safe space transportation. Before I hand it over to Karina, our chair, I would like to just mention a few words for the logistics of our building. So we have restrooms down the hall. If you come out of the room and exit to the right, go through the double doors, and on the left there will be the men's room and the ladies' room. And if you want to lunch, snack, coffee, go out this room again, but hang a left and proceed into the cafeteria area. Should there be an emergency, we'll go out right out. There's stairs to the left, and we can exit the building that way. Look forward to a very productive discussion and a good meeting today. And with that, I'll hand it over to our chair, Ms. Trees.
Thank you so much, Brian. Are we okay to speak from the table here anywhere in the room?
Yes.
Make sure. Okay. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing for CompStack, Brian. I look forward to today's meeting. I'm really happy that we're here being in person for a change, and looking forward also to hearing from the FAA the response to our previous recommendations. I'm grateful for the time the working groups have put into these tasks, given your many priorities in a growing industry. We've witnessed a dramatic increase in activity in recent past and only expect the industry to continue growing. The work done within the CompStack will become even more important as we look to incorporate industry's recommendations on topics that relate to the regulatory environment, safety, and infrastructure. At the end of today's meeting, we would like your suggestions on fall tasks. We hope to hold one more meeting before this CompStack's term expires. Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, I want to just second your thanks to Calvin and Brian for the support of the CompStack and the CompStack members. For those who don't follow the CompStack that closely, today is a lot of work that you'll hear about today was done by these members over the last few months. It's sort of other duties as assigned and quite a bit of effort. I just encourage the folks here today. I know all of the working groups have done a lot of work, but all of us haven't maybe fully digested some of the work, each working group's activity. And this is the time to do that and to really talk about it. So I think last CompStack, we had a pretty vibrant discussion on the 450 rules. We've got a couple other very meaty topics here today. And so, right, it can look a little messy, but that's part of, I think, what's good about the CompStack. We're able to talk about these issues openly and then reach to a conclusion where we can. So I appreciate the continued support of AST on this and your leadership.
Absolutely, thank you, Mike. And Mike's absolutely right. We've got some pretty incredible work that's been done on these tasks, so we're really looking forward to a robust discussion today. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Kelvin Coleman, Associate Administrator of the Office of Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. Kelvin leads the office responsible for enabling safe space transportation and protecting the health and safety of the public, the safety of property, and the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States. During his time at AST, he has overseen regulation of the commercial space industry, development and implementation of FAA regulations and services necessary to meet a tremendous growth in stakeholder needs as commercial companies provide space transportation to civil, military, international, and private customers. In 2023, his office licensed 124 launches and re-entry operations, and a 48% increase from just the year earlier. Kelvin has prepared the AST organization to meet these growing industry demands by establishing strategic priorities, restructuring the organization for increased efficiency and agility, acquiring advanced tools, and advocating for additional resources. Kelvin, we're delighted to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Karina. I'm used to quoting. Is that okay? All right. So thank you, Karina. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome everybody to CompStack's first meeting of 2024. I want to start out by reading you something the President of the United States said, quote, "Private enterprise made America great. And if our efforts in space are to show the same energy, imagination, and daring as those in our country, we must involve private enterprise fullest. By working to expand our involvement in space, we'll enhance life on this beautiful blue and green globe called Earth." End quote. These are familiar words today about the power of American ingenuity and courage, and the value brought to all of us by the commercial space enterprise. And the president who said them was Ronald Reagan. The year was 1984, and the occasion was the signing of an executive order. The executive order authorized the Transportation Department to enable private corporations to launch their own satellites into space. And along with it came the creation of the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. So I want to wish all of you who serve on ComStack a happy 40th anniversary. Over the last 4 decades, we have had about 150 people from more than 80 different companies sit in your positions, providing information, advice, and recommendations to the FAA on issues related to commercial space. We appreciate the work that you and your ComStack forebearers have done. The committee has served as a basis for our industry government collaboration and for identifying technology gaps and other challenges related to safety requirements and recommended practices. Counsel from experts who understand this quick evolving field and concrete actionable recommendations will be ever more needed and welcomed as the commercial space industry experiences a surge in activity and continues to change. We are looking forward to hearing about updates on your most recent taskings and receiving the meaningful directed recommendations of this group of senior leaders from across our industry. You are closest to the challenges and would benefit most from the solutions. In AST, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, we have been busy at work meeting our mission of enabling safe space transportation. And I'll share just a few recent accomplishments. We bolstered our staff to 145 people, and more good people are in the pipeline. Recruiting, hiring, and training are a top priority for us. We are also improving our processes and fine-tuning as we go along. This becomes especially important because of more and more demand for our products and services. We are a few measuring sticks. Here are a few measuring sticks we have to highlight our growth. We finished 2013 with 117 launches and 7 reentries, as Karina stated. That's a 48% increase over 2022. So far in this calendar year, we have had 43 FAA licensed launches and 3 reentries. Of those, 3 launches and 2 reentries have had human occupants on board. If we continue at the current rate, we could see 150 operations this year. Just last month in March, we had 17 operations, breaking our previous monthly record of 13 set in January. Breaking records is becoming routine to all of us. We're proud to be able to continue to say that no member of the public has ever been killed or significantly harmed, and there's been no significant property damage in our history of more than 700 FAA licensed commercial space launches. We can all take credit for that. And I know none of us will use that as an excuse for complacency. We plan to get better. AST's work increased in other ways as well. Last year, we completed 16 environmental reviews, an increase of 1/3 over the previous year. We conducted 790 inspections, a 28% increase over 2022. We invested 7 mishaps, a 75% increase over what we did in 2022 in that area. We also work with more than 60+ pre-application companies just to ensure they have the necessary tools available to them to kickstart their application process. And We engage in 116 international meetings as more and more nations are looking to the United States and the FAA for leadership as they attempt to stand up their own responsible and sustainable commercial space transportation systems. At the recent Space Symposium in Colorado, I heard a lot more about collaboration on data sharing as a domestic partner, and we're thinking through a path forward on reciprocity. Needless to say, it was an incredibly busy year. As many of you heard at Space Symposium, we're also engaged in various stages of rulemaking. Foremost is our continued work implementing Part 450 and encouraging industry to transition to it. Operators asked for this updated regulation on licensing, yet most of the operators who would benefit the most from it haven't yet started using it. We very much encourage applicants to use it as soon as possible and not wait until the March 2026 deadline. We know we have some work to do and some wrinkles to smooth out. And that's why I announced at the recent Commercial Space Transportation Conference that we co-hosted in February with the Commercial Space Federation that we would be creating a new aerospace rulemaking committee on Part 450 to iron out some of the wrinkles. The SPARK kickoff will be announced soon, and as I said in February, it will be before fall. And we look forward to the ideas and meaningful contributions from those of you who will be participating on SPARK. Just to note, this will be an effort to make improvements where needed to the rule. We are not restarting the rulemaking process wholesale. I'll just briefly touch on a couple of updates related to other rules and policies as well. As you know, we issued a proposed rule on mitigation of space debris in September 2023. We are currently reviewing public comments, and we expect to issue a rule on orbital debris early next year. Given the increasing complexity of payloads on the growing volume of FAA licensed launches and reentries, the FAA reminded applicants seeking a payload review that they must provide a complete manifest of the contents and compositions of all payloads. That was published in the Federal Register just last month. I spoke with many of you at the Space Symposium about this topic, and we're working closely with the FCC to clarify roles and responsibilities. Industry will have an opportunity to hear more about the payload process at an event the FAA is participating in, hosted by the FCC Space Bureau on May the 9th. And this month, we published a notice that let launch operators know that if they have a reentry vehicle as a payload, the reentry vehicle operator must have a reentry license approval before being considered to have a favorable payload determination. You'll get a full briefing on this later today, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. But we want to be clear that launching a vehicle to orbit that is designed to withstand reentry substantially intact, resulting in a ground impact, must have a reentry authorization to reduce the risk of a random, uncontrolled reentry. The options to ensure public safety are too limited once the vehicle is already in space and needs to reenter. So the details must be worked out before launch through the reentry vehicle licensing process. The most recent notice was part of our larger effort to improve the licensing applications we get from operators. The burden of proof on safety compliance rests with the applicants. Unfortunately, we are getting some ambiguous applications that don't spell out how regulatory requirements have been met and include materials and documents that aren't even tailored to address regulatory requirements. Some companies start the licensing process a little bit too late. And after they schedule a launch date that falls within our statutory review period. And they seem sometimes to be unprepared or unable to justify their safety case without a lot of go-backs. Inadequate inputs just lead to amendments and unnecessary delays. We all know that. We can always put our pencils down and make a determination within 180 days. That will result in a license or not. That's the simple reality. And that's what we're committed to doing as we see more licensing demand moving forward. We're doing what we can on our end. We hold office hours, issue clarifying advisory circulars, and have other ways to help beyond what is already spelled out in the process. Please take advantage of these opportunities to engage with us and build in adequate time for licensing. Licensing should not be an afterthought. We're also preparing for possible new responsibilities on the horizon, such as in-space mission authorization and examining future possibilities for human spaceflight regulation. To continue to be successful, we're going to need a stable, consistent stream of adequate funding. We're encouraged by the President's 2025 budget request. The proposed operations budget includes $57 million for the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, up from $42 million recently enacted in fiscal year 2024. That will allow us to add licensed application evaluators, inspectors, environmental protection specialists, mishap coordinators, and others to increase our capacity. It also gives us resources to start rulemakings, address gaps in standards, and conduct R&D. Of course, we'll need Congress to authorize and approve the President's request. And we appreciate your support and advocacy to fully fund FAA AST so we can continue to grow and be agile to address evolving needs. Again, I appreciate the fine work of this committee and look forward to the rest of today's meeting. And if there's time, I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Kelvin. Yeah, we actually have time if you're willing to take a few questions. I'll let you all start to think about what questions you might have. I'll kick it off, just maybe more of a comment, and just to let you and your team know, and I've spoken with Ben about this in the past as well, how much we appreciate the focus on the individuals that you're putting on the Sparks. And I think that's made a tremendous difference on the products that you're receiving from that group. So both the 440 and 460, we've noticed the products that industry is helping to develop, I think, are going to be really high quality. And just hopefully you'll have that same strategy with the 450 Spark as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And we really appreciate, I know it's a lot of hard work that's coming for 440, 460. We know it's not your day jobs. We understand you guys have day jobs and there's a lot of extra time put into those efforts. And so, you know, we have a report from the 440 Spark already. I've read through that. Looks like a really good report, some good recommendations. Looking forward to 460. And we'll do the same with 450.
Question for you, Kelvin. Good to see you this morning. Thanks for your remarks, and it's good to hear about we're looking forward to the Part 450 Spark. I think you talk about I guess one of the things that actually Blue Origin is concerned about is the transition into 450 that needs to be done by 2026. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you intend to balance the workload of those new incoming licenses, as well as the transition for those of us who are on other licenses and trying to transition.
Very carefully. No, it's a challenge. It'll certainly be a challenge. That's why we're really emphasizing the necessity of companies that will need to transition to Part 450 to do it sooner rather than later. We don't want to find ourselves in a bottleneck, early in 2026 or late in 2026, trying to transition companies that have been leveraging legacy regulations. I think we'll be prepared as a staff. We're bringing in more staff members. We'll be able to continue the work that we've been doing, keep the current licenses moving. We'll also have enough staff, I believe, work with companies that will need to transition over 450. So I think that's something we'll be able to balance and work out.
Thank you so much. Echo Megan's comments about appreciating the thought, and especially the plans to do a Spark on 450. And one of the things that I have had, I feel like there have been conversations about is in the meantime, right, because that process will take some time, allowing companies to use the prior regulations, 415, 417, as means of compliance for 450 especially in terms of singular missions where they're not looking to try and take advantage of, shall we say, the opportunity that 450 presents to have a whole host of launch sites, for example, reentry sites and vehicles, but really want to kind of get maybe one demonstration done or just one mission done, and that might be a more expeditious path. Can you speak a little bit to how you're thinking about that possibility, and potentially implementing that, to help applicants?
Leverage 450 and 470.
Yeah, leveraging the legacy regulations to get through 450 for, given the readily identified challenges with 450, particularly things like methodologies, which may not be necessary if you're trying to get off singular missions.
Sure. Yeah, well, if you may recall, when we started work on 450 performance-based, we talked about the fact that 415, 417, we followed that. It would be, you would be able to demonstrate regulatory compliance with 450 because 415, 417 could be a leverage that you use as a means of compliance. So if companies are following 415 and 417, we think that they will be able, in good shape, to be able to demonstrate compliance with 450. So we've seen some of that, not a lot of, but we've seen some of that. So I think if your question is, you can't 415, 417 leverage as an MOC or means of compliance, I would say absolutely yes, you can.
And also as a means to kind of perhaps get through the process a little faster, given the challenges that usually come with the methodologies piece, which you can circumvent by virtue of using a means of compliance.
Sure,
for
I
a
think that
singular.
can lend itself to expediency through the process. Compliance has always been found in a longer pole than to navigate. That's why, I think it's important for companies that are coming in a 450 for the first time and are standing up or showing us or demonstrating to us things like flight safety methodologies for the first time. It's very important to take advantage of our office hours and things such as that, where we can talk to companies more about what we're looking for, what that compliance should look like. Also emphasize what I just said, that I think it's important for companies also to do a better job with their applications coming in. Process is a jury process by us. We're assessing what's come in. If applications need work, then that's going to require go back some other iterations back and forth between us and the company. So, ideally, in an ideal world, we would have to do things like technical evaluations, whereby at the end of the process, we have to really articulate what the applicant has provided demonstrates compliance with the board. That takes some time at the end. If the application were pristine, I'm not being critical, I'm just saying, if the application were pristine, the application itself would spell out, this is how compliance is demonstrated. We say, yep, there it is right there on paper. We can accept that and forward out the need of doing an evaluation again, which adds time.
The point is, how close are we to seeing an application template? For example, if you look, there's a great sample application for an experimental permit on the website that's really helps spell out for a company exactly what they need to do. Makes people like me unnecessary almost. But for part 450, and these very complicated matters for which people are experiencing for the first time, do you think we'll see something like that sometime soon?
Possibly. I wouldn't rule it out. I don't think that we've actively been working on an application, but maybe this is something that this committee can think about, give us some advice on if that's necessary. You mentioned the permits template, which is there. Not a lot of people are doing permits these days, but that's there. We've tried to allow companies a lot of flexibility in terms of how they present information to us. We haven't really stipulated here's a form, but maybe it's something we ought to think more about. Certainly, it could probably help us. As I think about it here on the spot, it probably help us move more speedily in the process.
Can I have one quick follow-up on Karen's point about means of compliance? I know that there's a lot of companies that are looking to the ACs and whether or not they're taking advantage of the performance-based rules. One of the things we've been noticing is that some of the new methods that don't exactly match the ACs are not being accepted. And I would just, I'd love to encourage the team under your leadership to sort of open up their aperture on how we meet the regulations, because again, 450 being performance-based, the AC is one mechanism that we can use to satisfy our regulatory compliance. But when we're offering alternatives, it's often being turned away because it doesn't look exactly like the AC.
Yeah, that's a fair ask.
Yeah.
That's a fair ask. Yeah, we can certainly take a look at that. We're trying, now, I will say this about Part 450 in particular. I mean, we do, so for 450, so first of all, 450 is about, it's about, so we're getting our arms around it as industry is doing the same, getting this. So I'm sure that as we get more experience, as industry gets more experience, that average will be open up a bit more in terms of what we recognize compliance to be.
I just want to commend you on sort of taking affirmative steps to be part of and working with the FCC Space Bureau on their payload activity. I think the same should be very true on Orbital 3. I think the more, the more that you all could be talking before rules are issued or new notices are issued, it would be very helpful to the community to not have possibly two different frameworks that folks have to respond to. I think a lot of the activity, particularly with payload review and orbital review, really gets into what essentially is mission authorization, if you sort of extend where that could go. So I just commend that you're taking sort of, affirmative steps to make sure that you're involved in what they're doing when you're talking to the space group.
Well, thank you, Mike. I agree with you 100%. I think it's important for the FCC, Department of Commerce, the FAA to be joined at the hip on these issues and not have silos. So we're looking forward to engaging in the conversation with the FCC on the 9th. They're going to take a look at the payload review process, in particular how they're really for their own interests, making sure that the licenses that should be issued by the FCC are in fact in place and not slipping through that process. And so we're going to talk about that to make sure that we aren't missing anything in that regard. So but I agree with that. That's something we're doing.
I don't know, is someone from FAA monitoring the Zoom? Because I know we've got a couple of members online today. I don't know if folks have questions online. Do we have any way of tracking that?
I'm not tracking this.
You have a team in the other room that is fully supporting us.
Okay.
Give me a thumbs up.
See you then.
We'll be aware of any questions.
Hey, Clea, it's Mike. I'm online. I can see if you guys can hear me. We can try that.
We can hear you. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we could jump in off mute and ask questions if we need to.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. Any final questions for Kelvin? All right. Well, Kelvin, thanks again. We really appreciate all of your support at ComStack, everything that you're doing for AST and everything you're doing for industry. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you. And appreciate that. And one last thing I will mention, next week, I think it's next week, yeah, it is. We look forward to hosting Astrolab Space next week. They will have their rover parked in front of the building here next week on April 30th from 11 to 2 p.m. to demonstrate their rover capabilities. So if any of you are in the area, we look forward to seeing you. Please come out and join us. Thank you.
All right, next on our agenda, we're going to dive into the all-important ComStack taskings. First, I just want to mention in the FAA, we did put a lot of thought and care into what we tasked the FAA, or the ComStack group. Many of these taskings are informed by previous taskings to ComStack, the findings and the recommendations that we did receive. We do want to try to carry those forward. So on December 4th, I did task ComStack with 6 taskings. First task, provide any observations, findings, or recommendations on AC 450.45-1, which is for space nuclear systems, and also what recommendations can ComStack provide to the FAA to ensure that it contributes to Space Sponsor Directive 6. Task 2 was provide FAA suggested fixes to specific 450 requirements. FAA submitted its top 12 Part 450 focus areas to ComStack on December 22nd of 2023. And task 3, review the 2023 recommended practices for space flight occupant safety and provide any observations, findings, or recommendations to this document. Task 4 was research possible frameworks that use industry consensus standards as a means of compliance for performance-based safety requirements and provide recommendations on how the commercial space industry might use similar frameworks. Task 5 was research options on commercial space transport, standing up a research alliance made up of government, military, and academia to foster research and development. Task 6, evaluate space transportation infrastructure funding options, and assist in the implementation of the most promising approach. Looking ahead, I'm anticipating our afternoon discussion on future ComStack tasks and proposals to continue to carry out our work. Now, I'm excited to hear an update on the progress of these tasks. Yeah, over to you.
Excellent, thanks so much, Brian. So we'd like to start with the two tasks for the regulatory working group, and just a personal thanks to Karen, especially for her leadership on this, and I know you put personally a lot of hours into this, and I just can't tell you how much we appreciate it, because I think the product is really great. So we budgeted quite a bit of time, because there's a lot of detail in these two tasks. So we really encourage members of the ComStack to engage in this discussion and make sure we get our questions answered, comments out. So over to you, Karen.
All right, great. Yes, dense work here. So I want to recognize the members of the regulatory working group who contributed to this as well: Megan, Kate, Ganesh, Julie, and Jay. And also members of the broader ComStack, because given the topics and the representatives on the regulatory working group, but also folks that aren't on the RWG, I did reach out to members on both of these tasks, and also to members of our community who are interested in these topics, and ask them to contribute their time and thoughts to this. So I'll note that I didn't get 100% participation. But I did get really impressive participation. And so there were folks who came back to me and said, especially on the first task, the space nuclear systems task, this is something that we need to spend a good amount of time on, given demands on their time, either the CEO of a startup company or they're working to support another government agency on this topic. They were limited in their ability to respond. But it raised the point that this is a topic for which there are some really impressive group of people who are subject matter experts, and a really impressive group of companies, both experienced, established companies and new companies that are interested in this topic and that are planning for a day when this payload review process will be necessary to their successes. So I say that to say that the work of the subcommittee or the working group and the report that we will provide, I would say take it as an interim step towards the perfection of this advisory circular, with further necessary steps to continuing to provide. I encouraged folks that provided really deep dives into the advisory circular to also provide those to the FAA as comments to the advisory circular. Their individual, both as representatives of their individual companies. So if anybody is listening who has not done that or has not thought to do that, I want to remind you that for this advisory circular, for all advisory circulars, at any point in time, you can provide your comments to the FAA to help inform the improvements or approach to those advisory circulars. So I think we have some slides that we can go through. The real task here, and the report is pretty extensive. So I've compiled the notes, and I think that it might be helpful to kind of go broadly through some of the slides, and we can talk about the report as well. But so who has those?
Slides. If I just call out slide, yeah, it's a slide.
Next slide.
Okay. So this was the task that we were given, both to look at AC 450.45-1, covering space nuclear systems. So this is an advisory circular to provide guidance on what an entity needs to do to seek approval for launching a space nuclear system as a payload on an FAA licensed launch vehicle or a reentry vehicle, most likely a launch vehicle at this point. And then what recommendations ComStack can provide with regard to SP6 if fulfilling the objectives of SP6. Next slide. Okay, so here are some of the findings, and of course, if there are edits, I'm happy to have people give inputs real time. I will note that I am a space nuclear enthusiast, but not an expert. So you could actually just call me a nuclear power and propulsion evangelical. I think that this is incredibly important to the future of our space exploration. So I felt really personally excited about trying to improve the AC and engage with the people who are thinking about this, though I will admit that I understood what they were saying half the time, maybe. So I attempted to pull from their inputs, some key points. I also want to really acknowledge Ann Zukowski, who hopefully will be able to join us either online, I'm not sure, but maybe today, who contributed, as well as I mentioned, other folks who are members of CONSTAC, but also people who are not. So a critical issue, so a couple of notes about what the SPD says with regard to what we should be trying to accomplish here. And then a critical issue that was identified in comments regarding the AC was the need for expedited decision-making processes. One of the things that I thought was really interesting as somebody who comes into this thinking more about the launch licensing side and what the CSLA says, is that I heard from folks that they would be excited if they could get through a payload review on an SNS in 365 days. We have a 180-day, statutory process for doing the launches. That is where their hearts and minds are with regard to the challenge that this represents. That even 365 days would be reasonable to them. So really this note about some kind of when it says a need for an expedited decision-making processes, put that in context. That's the feedback that I got on the report. The real goal there being that there be consistent timeframes that folks can identify where they're at. It's similar feedback to what we hear on all of the regulatory implementations and reviews. The need for a framework to which they could understand that these are the steps and the processes that they would follow and who is responsible at what stage of that process for what review ahead of getting to a launch or reentry decision, or launch or reentry license, so that it can feed into that process. And then another piece was establishing the threshold. So one of the points that I heard from a couple of people was that the Department of Transportation has successfully identified very small amounts of nuclear materials that can be transported safely in other modes of transportation. Can't we do that here, right? Couldn't we say okay, if it's something that is already able to go on a plane, train, automobile, bus, shouldn't it be kind of pre-authorized with the Department of Transportation for space activities as well? And was given an actual kind of idea of what that would be in terms of the calculations. Okay, next slide. Or any questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I may, just so these are not the specific recommendations themselves. These are just the findings.
Yeah, these were things that I took that notable with regard to what we're asked to look at SPD 6. Here are some key aspects of SPD 6 that were kept in mind, and then here were some things that I found consistent through feedback.
Okay. Are we going to explore at some point the discussion specifically related to the example that you just gave about material being transported on trains and trucks and others versus lifting to orbit? Is there a point?
We can discuss it right now. Absolutely.
Okay. My concern with that analogy is that you're talking about different physiology and different potential results, right? Carrying material on a train or a truck, it runs off. Yes, you'll have an incident or an accident in some localized area where it comes off the rails, goes off the track. You're talking about lifting a nuclear body or nuclear capability into orbit on a vehicle that's really a controlled explosion getting off the ground. A catastrophic event there is drastically different than one that is a train or a vehicle coming off the road. So I'm sorry. I think we have to be careful with that kind of analogy when you're talking about what we're talking about here, which is lifting nuclear material to space or in orbit.
Fair. And again, I don't even ski, I snowboard. I am way far over the end of my snowboard, let's say, or skis, when I start trying to engage in this, because I think that this is an example of a discussion that is really important to having people who are real experts on this topic, because one could readily conflate all types of nuclear material and all types of nuclear capabilities, when in fact there are some, as I understand it, that could be involved in a launch incident explosion, and there would be really very minimal to no risk to public, other than a hard thing that is a solid material falling on somebody, no different than a piece of the rocket itself, right? Because it is not already enriched or active at the time of the launch. So I think that this point being made is to that point, right? That the idea that if something can fly on an airplane and be at risk that it's going to be in our public airspace and be approved, then a rocket explosion that is launched in a controlled hazard area for which we remove the public. So of course we have to take the advisory circular and this approach in light of our current approach to licensing launch vehicles and reentry vehicles, which means that we clear the public and we accept the idea that you may have a catastrophic event with the vehicle, but you've protected the public, that this would be in light of that. And that could also be tuned, so to speak, to activities that one could say in that situation would not pose any additional risk to the public.
So maybe it's not the same standard as going on a bus or a train or an aircraft, but developing a standard that a minimum below could be acceptable for first space launch, rather than saying, well, just because it could be in a bus means it could be
The same one, correct. And the point of the comments that I received was that it's not saying that you would, all of a sudden like check, you could take that thing here, you can take that thing here. That we could do some analysis, but then going forward, there would be kind of like a blanket acceptance of certain capabilities versus having to go for an approval every time of that single, which actually mirrors conversations about this topic generally, which is that, one of the challenges that we've had with space nuclear systems to date, and this is documented in a number of reports that have been done, including by SIBI IDA in support of SPD6 and the discussions leading up to SPD6, is that we've treated every nuclear payload to date as a one-off, one of its kind approach. And we don't have kind of a systematic approach to that, or a template that says, if you do X, then you will be approved. But if you do Y, then we're gonna have to go through a whole review, because we just don't have enough practice here. And so that was also some of the commentary here, is that need to move towards having some categories and clear indications of, and transparency around approval, so that if if an entity does it, then others can follow on that approach. So
I would submit that this area probably needs some more discussion.
absolutely. So there's a lot more discussion that needs to be had on this topic. And I think it's a great example where reliance on experts and expert experience with the topic is incredibly important, which is one of the recommendations, I believe. It certainly is something that's reflected in the recommendations for the report, is engaging, with experts in the field, both with industry experts, with academic experts, and with experts within government to support the advisory, any implementation of the advisory circular and continued revision of the advisory circular.
That's important. This topic can become very emotional.
Yes.
Based on data. You made a very good point about the range is clear of hazards during launch. So it'd be interesting to know if when we transport material by train or by truck, it can go to populated areas, go through tunnels. I mean, that's a lot more hazardous than something falling down the range probably.
Well, if you think about I think one of the ideas here is medical devices, right? So medical devices get transported in mass transit kind of situations with apparently some regularity. Again, I'm not tracking them, but so I have a lot of humility with regard to this. I really want to show a great deal of respect for people who spend every day thinking about these topics, because they had a lot of feedback on this, and then some of which I couldn't quite adjudicate because of my lack of expertise, but it's really impressive.
I think it's important to do that, because you have to understand the characteristics of the nuclear material you're talking about moving. Some of it behaves differently in a ground accident scenario versus an air accident scenario. That material characteristics will be different. So I fully agree. We need to get the guys who really know this stuff. I grew up in the nuclear world, back in the day when I had hair.
We will connect those two things.
Okay, no, it's okay. That's all right. I was out there putting my hand on it, in underground missile silos. And you really need the experts involved in this discussion. So because the material reacts differently depending on what the material is. a ground scenario is different than an air scenario. And not only in terms of spread and carrying, but the characteristics of the material.
Right.
So I'd just be careful with that analogy, that kind of tweak.
Well, we could certainly tweak the language to someday say, noting that the DOT has, taken actions to establish these thresholds. Perhaps this could provide an approach that would be helpful to Space Nuclear. I'm happy to make a few tweaks to that along those lines, just to make sure we're characterizing it with the sensitivity that's necessary. Jake, please.
So, this might not be the right place to inject this, but, more similar analogy could be like nuclear submarines. Pretty regularly in operation. And there is a safety protocol around nuclear safety on submarines. So, that could be something that, explore.
Absolutely. I think that's a great example too of that this is not a topic for which we have no expertise in the US government or in industry or in the United States. Perhaps we should have more than we do, but it is certainly, there are many places that we should be looking, and I think that's a point that the report certainly wants to make sure the commentators on the advisory circular and on my attempt to reflect in the report that sentiment that we don't need to recreate the wheel for space. We do need to be sensitive to the specific aspects of space, but there are places we can tap into for folks who do analysis on this.
Sure.
Yes.
Quick question, because I'm late to the party, but we've been looking at this closely because there's a lot of obviously space issues.
Yeah.
And one of the issues, and I was just curious, if part of the conversation so far is evidently there's an issue of a nuclear payload if a commercial nuclear payload is processed at a NASA facility, but then crosses over onto a spaceport facility for launch, that action triggers all sorts of additional permitting activities. Was that looked at?
No, because the advisory circular so that's a topic that I think, is an important one. I'm not sure, I think my read on that would be that it falls outside FAA and AST's jurisdiction to some degree, because it's not part of the launch activity, right? So it becomes a range, maybe a PHMSA issue. I'm guessing, so I'm
that was
out
sort
of
of my
my
question.
for this one. But I agree, this is a topic that I am aware of, that folks are thinking about is how do you, when it's not a government payload and the government isn't taking responsibility for managing those aspects, which it has done in the past, what does it look like to integrate a nuclear payload on a federal range or at a private facility, and that those ground aspects.
Okay, because I figured that was something we were needing to be addressed because there's been attention, and I guess it's another regulatory agency that's going to come to the table,
right?
Which is fine. But I also agree, particularly with John's point, that we can work with the experts and get everything technically tight. But when you say radioactivity in the minds of the public, whether it's some of the new, much less dangerous radioactive materials, as opposed to plutonium and uranium,
right.
It's different, but that distinction is not what the public's grasp.
Right, yes. Well, we always enjoy thinking about how we explain what we do in this world to the public.
Yeah.
So the ground piece is a separate piece because the AC, which we really focused on, is about that payload review piece. So what does it look like to get acceptance from the FAA, approval from the FAA, that would then allow a launch operator to integrate the payload with a launch operator, and then do all of the work that the FAA would have to do for that payload. So from the safety during launch, orbital debris, like all of those pieces would come into play with the advisory. Okay, can adjust this finding, but next slide for the observations. And again, I will concur with anybody who says that findings, observations anyway. So FAA published the AC in 2023. It's meant to be a means of compliance and guidance for proposing a launch arena or SNS, space nuclear systems, to get through the review under 450.45 and seek payload determination. So if an SNS were to come to the FAA seeking a payload review ahead of then being integrated into a launch vehicle, so an independent payload review, so to speak. So observations, the FAA would benefit from collaborating with the NRC, given the NRC licensed SNS will be subject to FAA approvals of payloads, and the commercial space industry would benefit from clarification regarding which agency, if any, has licensing authority with respect to SNS's ability to operate in space or on celestial bodies. That's another piece of this, perhaps separate from the payload review, but definitely triggered by these questions of what are you getting an approval for, and then what do you do from there? So, okay, next slide, and let's, discussion, sorry.
Was DOE brought into this dialogue at all?
I'm sorry?
The Department of Energy,
Yep.
were they brought into this dialogue at all?
You mean, with regard to the advisory circular that was developed,
Right.
ahead of the advisory circular developing?
Yes.
I think so, yeah, I think yes, the DOE, NRC, and,
The entire insert, all the.
yeah, I was gonna say, I thought it was like a full interagency session.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and so here are the recommendations that this reflects the recommendations that I have received. These, I will note, are broader statements of the recommendations. There are some very detailed edits, like delete, replace, mathematic kind of edits or suggestions that are reflected in the text of the I'm just gonna look to see how many page report, 28-page report that I have that has been circulated to members of the ComStat, and with regard to the advisory circular. So I'll let you all read through these and then happy to have further discussion on them.
I think there's another element that I think that has to be folded into the discussion too, particularly when you talk about launching radioactive materials in small quantities without overly burdensome safety standards. I absolutely agree with that. I don't think that's out of line. I think though that you have to tie to that is the launch heritage of the rocket upon which it's going to lift. If the FAA is going to bless that, say, okay, it's a small quantity and we think the risk is acceptable, you don't want to be launching that stuff on a launch vehicle that's only launched successfully twice. Right? Flight heritage becomes relevant, so with that kind of decision. So if you have a particular rocket model that's launched 100 consecutive times successfully, that risk is probably pretty low versus one that's launched a new rocket design that's launched twice.
And that is reflected in the report and in the advisory circular. So for example, there's an item on page 17 of the AC, and reflecting on that was that one of the comments is to give you insight into the details if you haven't had a chance to review the report at the level of detail that I received. The advisory circular states that the FAA will review applicants' submitted information, looking for ways that interactions between the SNS and the launch or reentry vehicle might have public safety implications. Now here, interactions is an undefined term, and the question there is, do you mean interactions things like that a piece of the rocket flies into the SNS and they interact with each other, or interactions with regard to the level of safety, the point about the reliability and level of safety. So I think that's an example of how detailed we've gotten, and whether we're talking about malfunctions of systems or planned interactions or levels of safety interactions. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I guess my questions definitely come from extreme ignorance because I'm also a snowboarder. But I guess on one hand, what I don't see is the FAA revoking licenses once stuff is like on orbit, and does the FAA follow up with operators to make sure that they're current on the healthy status of these systems? And maybe there's something that changes operationally that would then be worthy of basically saying, no, you can't operate this in this way anymore because something fundamentally changed about the space system, even for reentries and that sort of stuff. So I guess I don't know where that is covered. And to your last point about, address challenges with procuring insurance for launches of SNS, what could the FAA possibly do to help in that process? Like, what specifically is the recommendation for how the FAA should help in that regard, I guess?
Yeah, so I'll start with that one and then go back to your first question with regard to enforcement, which is essentially well, take that to me. So on the challenges with procuring insurance, because it would be inappropriate for me to deep dive into the discussions of the Space Advisory Rulemaking Committee that evaluated Part 440, which is the indemnification and insurance conversation, because the report has not been public or made public yet. I will note that this was a topic that committee took up and looked at and found that there are challenges with procuring insurance for these kinds of capabilities. So, the FAA's insurance indemnification regime requires an MPL, and then that MPL requires the procurement of insurance up to a certain amount, up to $500 million, to cover public risk. And the challenge that we heard, and this has been talked about somewhat publicly, is that there's been a lack of willingness to insure nuclear payloads. And so one of the ways I would opine, if you ask me without reference to 440, that you could cover that is to, it's covered, under government launches, it could be covered under PL 85804, which is the indemnification regime for ultra hazardous activities. But the FAA could recognize that insurance for a nuclear payload or a launch involving a nuclear payload cannot be reasonably obtained, and therefore allow a waiver of the insurance and provide indemnification from first dollar, or separate out the MPL for the vehicle launch that would be resulted, if you could, from the other. But that doesn't seem to be readily available, right? So it would be a matter of, are we willing to, because of our interest in facilitating these activities, can we indemnify from first dollar rather than bankrupting a company as it tries to procure insurance that costs more than the payload? And then on your first question with regard to
Maybe before you leave that one, just is it, maybe Cal, this is for you, do you all think that would require statutory change?
I was wondering that, Mr. Chair, first down. I don't know if we can do a regulatory regulation on our own without Congress giving us some credit to do that. My hunch is we'll probably need some statutory.
Yeah, I think it's a question would be, to the extent that insurance cannot be reasonably obtained, or how would you evaluate that? And of course, the interesting point there is that if it's an SNS payload, the launch vehicle is what is receiving the license, and so the burden is on the launch operator, the launch licensee, which creates some significant tension between payload operators and national interests with regard to getting these kinds of payloads into orbit to facilitate, I'd say, sustainable, I would say more sustainable, in my opinion, space exploration activities and sustained space activities. And so solving that problem is an important to solving our interests in terms of being able to facilitate these activities, because otherwise, launch operators have no incentive to integrate these payloads.
And I guess a bit of a leading question, right? I think that probably, whether you have statutory for your need, probably depends who you ask, is my guess, right? But I think now that we have the Congress considering comprehensive commercial space legislation, certainly statutory needed to clarify this, whether we can do it now or not. So I think that may be something for all of us to think about as an item we need to raise.
Yeah, and so to enforcement, right now, the FAA oversees launch and reentries, right, and does not have oversight of in-orbit activities. We, of course, are all actively talking about how that will change. We have a proposal from the White House, mission authorization, which would significantly impact the FAA's authorities. And there are enforcement provisions in Title 51 for the FAA vis-a-vis the activities that they can authorize. And so that same question would be, I think, apply that same kind of. I would expect that if their authorities were expanded, that same those same powers would extend to the activities in orbit. So right now, for example, if a launch vehicle operator were to violate their license could be revoked. So that violation could occur before they even launch, potentially depending upon when it's attempted, and it could affect their ability to operate in the future. So if a launch vehicle operator has a license to launch multiple vehicles, particularly under 450, so they have a standing launch license, operator's license, an enforcement action could include revoking their license, which would eliminate their ability to launch going forward.
Understood. I guess let's another scenario, right? Let's talk about reentries. If somebody's getting some authorization for some reentry, like pre-launch, and then something happens on orbit where it's not a great idea for the thing to reenter, like how the FAA even know about such a thing? And
Those kind of anomalies have to be reported to the FAA, and the FAA would, because if it affects their public safety, if it affects the public safety risk, then the operator is responsible for engaging with the FAA to address those anomalies.
so really it's just up to the operator on just like, hey, I just want to let you know this is what's going on with my satellite, and you should in good conscience tell me not to bring this thing back in, like.
Well, so the FAA does utilize, and Kelvin, please jump in here. The FAA does utilize. So the FAA also engages with inspectors who are involved in inspecting the operator's activities. My understanding is that the expectation of that inspection aspect prior to engaging or initiating the reentry activity, right? Because the license kicks in with regard when you're planning to initiate the reentry, that inspection involvement and the FAA continuing accuracy involvement would have the inspector have access to information with regard to the reentry activity, as well as, of course, the expectation that we all operate according to the rules that we all agree to and that are held accountable to. So, I guess being somebody who's been on the industry side, I think that there's every incentive to engage meaningfully with the FAA and to try and find a solution if you have an anomaly that would affect your risk profile, because the last thing anybody wants is to have unintended consequences, negative consequences come from an action where you did not address an unexpected risk. Yeah, Kelvin, anything that you want to add there?
I think you did. I think you did on that. The responsibility of the applicant is to ensure that its operation consistent with its representations in the application. If there's any deviation for whatever reason from those representations in the application, it's incumbent upon the responsibility of the applicant or the operator to inform the FAA of those deviations and get approval from the FAA if it intends to act in accordance with those deviations. So, if in a situation where something was wrong or something changed, they would conduct the operation consistent with representations of the application, and that would be grounds for violation and action, further action.
So well beyond good graces, they're required to inform you.
Yeah, and of course, any lack thereof leads to enforcement.
I don't know if this is totally relevant, but there is quite a bit of guidance or recommendations on AC regarding disposal in contingency scenarios. In particular with nuclear emissions. I don't know when, how likely you want to re-enter with nuclear payload. Often you launch nuclear payloads, you want to go deep space or something like that. So disposal is quite an energy intensive event. So I think there's hazards there that gets looked at pre-launch as part of the payload. So I do think there's much more detail that's required in there. Comments that I made, but I think if I'm understanding the concern correctly, I think that's where it might be covered and captured pre-launch.
Yeah, pulling on that string a little bit more, there needs to be, I think, either a recommendation or in the AC somewhere itself where it talks about what happens to a nuclear payload once it's past surface line. If it's out way out in Mars somewhere, you don't have an issue, right? But if it's not, to say it's out in geosynchronous orbit, right? So what are you gonna do with it? You know, are you gonna super sync it out toward Mars, or are you gonna try to bring it back? What are you gonna do with it? Because if you don't address it somehow, you end up just complicating your debris problem, right? And it needs to be addressed somehow.
And that goes to the second bullet here, which is, and this is again, in line with the idea that we were looking at SPD 6 and the advisory circular. So the advisory circular, you know, of course, limited to the FAA's authorities to look at payloads that are going to be launched and not necessarily operations in orbit. The second notes that concern with regard to who's responsible and what does the oversight look like once you're in space and operating.
You know more about that second bullet than I do, but that's not what that says. What that second bullet says to me is that they're going to regulate the operations during the service life of that vehicle. That's what they're going to be concerned when I look at that bullet.
Okay.
It does not address for me what we were just talking about, which is, okay, when it's beyond service life, it's done, what do you do with it?
I mean, we could simply, again, the report does speak to disposal, again, despite the fact that it's not necessarily fully within, you know, the payload in the future, what the FAA has oversight of. I will concede that readily that this bullet could have read has authority for licensing and could have taken out the operation SNSs, and that would have called full life. Yeah.
Well, let me, so I just sort of to that point, right? So the AC has quite a bit in it about disposal.
Right.
And then sort of Jay's point, the report has several recommendations in furthering those, making comment on the existing disposal requirements. So, you know, I think that there's quite a bit of thoughtful stuff on that topic that is in here. Certainly, if there's more to add, I mean, that's great, but I don't want to dismiss what folks have added.
Correct. That is correct. Yes. And I will take full responsibility for how well I did or did not characterize these in the quick bullet recommendation.
Listen, I thank you for having the boldness to take the spears.
I knew it, like I was like, this is dangerous territory. Not the nuclear stuff. I'd be less scared of that.
Well, to your defense, I think the operations does cover disposable.
Yeah, there's a whole section in here.
Right. So
On Earth is not recommended.
Right.
I was a bit critical about that point, though. That we need to be really specific about the disposal piece and, you know, constitutes end of the operations. So I do think
Yeah, I will note, for example, that one expert who's engaged with one of our leading agencies on this topic, who I was put in touch with, you know, wrote back and said, there's just so much here that needs to be explored, and I have so many recommendations and I don't have the time to provide them. And I shared with that person the report as it was developing, and they said back, there's still so much more here. So again, great regard for what we have tried to accomplish and what we have accomplished in the report, and want to make sure that we're emphasizing that this is not the end of the conversation. This should not be the end of the conversation. Any further discussion? Karina, how should we proceed with regard to the report?
So, I guess that's a good question. Is this something that you would recommend continuing work on throughout the summer and close it out in the fall? Is there anything specific you want the council members to vote on today?
I mean, I think that the report at this point, unless anybody has, I'm open to the idea that we need to continue work on it. I'm also open to the idea that we say we should circulate it and finalize it. Because I think that it's pretty, 28 pages worth of comments are worth getting to the FAA at this point, and I would say this is the topic should be one that the FAA needs to consider. There's a lot to consider here. And as we'll talk about on 450, I think the FAA has a backlog of comments with regard to advisory circulars. So we should just get this into the mix and then we can go from there. But that I'm not sure what quite the procedure, if we should, right, and then finalize it among the members and then submit it, how we should proceed with that. Because I did receive some late breaking edits that I think we need to recirculate to the group.
Right. So that's why I was questioning, are we in a good place, at least for the recommendations, to vote on the recommendations today? Aside from like a couple of the wordsmithing edits today. Folks feel comfortable with the recommendations to take a roll call vote?
I would say, as long as we don't say that these are the end state, right? That this is what we know and what we're willing to comment at this time, that there will be more comments, more recommendations.
You need a motion for it?
Absolutely.
So move.
Okay.
Is it possible to submit it as an interim?
I'm happy to do any of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if AST feels they want to take a deeper dive into this, they can retask the contact with something more specific, maybe, with this task.
I could ask, I may just articulate again the last recommendation, what that is, to address challenges.
So this was I think someone appropriately raised that this was a topic that came up in the 440 Spark. And so given that is, it's running its course separately, the report has been provided to the FAA, it would be wrong to miss that this is a topic that is important to this conversation here before CompStat versus, and so I'd say like the FAA should address challenges, C Spark, 440 Spark.
I hadn't thought about that. Kelvin, it might be useful to get the underwriters together and have an education session for them with some of the experts that you were talking about. And out of that could come an idea that, okay, well, this is a reasonably insurable risk, or some data that says it's absolutely not reasonably insurable, and so we need some regulations to indemnify folks if we want to stimulate this cover. But I don't imagine that the insurance industry is going to speak. And so getting them educated would be a good first step.
Yeah.
We've been talking to insurers on a number of topics, and you mentioned commercial nuclear materials being insured. You get a deer in headlights.
Yeah, but it's an emotional reaction, right?
So I
formed opinion.
obviously, if our education could bring them into the market, that would be the best case scenario. But I think the point Karen was trying to make is it may very well be that they go, we don't want to touch that. The feds are going to have to account for that and do whatever's necessary to allow the market participants.
I mean, my impression there is that to date, there has not been, the insurance community has not been expected to provide coverages for commercial nuclear activities, right? So we have like the Price Waterhouse Act, we have, PL 85804. So we have implemented policies, statutes that govern indemnification and claims related to nuclear activities. And so, with we have these approved activities. So of course, any one of us goes is an X-ray. There are these minor activities that are incorporated into our day-to-day lives. There's seemingly a big gap between those and everything else that is, not insured but covered, in my understanding, by some kind of policy, because we want the activity to occur. And so, this is the terrestrial and space. Terrestrial has an interesting challenge here too, because we think about commercial applications terrestrially.
Nuclear material on top of a rocket, it's a lot like some of the generals.
Yes, it does. And because I am a nuclear evangelical, I will suggest a book, A Bright Future, to all of you, which demyths a lot of people's thoughts and understandings with regard to the risk of nuclear activities and promotes the benefits of particularly terrestrial and nuclear vehicles. A bright future. Because I have a microphone.
Then is my motion to, am I moving this to be an interim, or is this we're closing the book on this one with an expectation the FAA will never follow on? I'll do whatever, I'm just.
Right. My suggestion is that we vote on the recommendations today, minus like a couple of the wordsmithing tweaks that we mentioned here today. We ask the ComStack members to continue iterating on the written report, which Karen, we received some late breaking comments on.
I just circulated those to everybody.
Okay, great. And that we intend to move forward on this as a vote and not continue work on this as an official task over the summer. If the FAA spends the time to review the written report, once we turn it in, and makes the determination that there's a little bit additional information that they would request from ComStack, then they would come back and retask the ComStack at that time. So my recommendation is that we move forward with the vote today.
Well, question, will there be some nuclear task if we vote on this today?
I mean, it's gonna depend on what AST, I guess, finds from after reading the report, if they feel like they need a little bit more information.
Maybe
I would submit that the work is not done. So, I'm okay to vote, but the work is not done, and it sounds like we're trying to put a bow on this, right? And
Well,
put it on.
I think so. That's a fair point. I think what we're trying to do is give some collectively have at this point, because the AC is always open, right? This is always an open area for topic for comment. I think it's not sort of the work is done. Is this a moment in time pause that we give something to react to while we keep thinking further? I think that's how to think about it. But that's at least how I'm thinking about it. That we're not done, but we do want to say, hey, we have something here now that we'd like the FAA to deliberate on.
But how does that turn into action for the following work? That's what I'm trying.
So
What you just said, I can think about it any way you want, but the point is, how does that turn into action?
So I think the question I would have is, what is if we were to leave the task open for follow-on work, what is the follow-on work? Because I have personally exhausted what I think I can accomplish with this task by generating this report and doing the survey of industry experts who are available to give me feedback at this time, compile their feedback into this report in an attempt to do justice to their comments, as well as sort through some differences of comments. And so I guess I'm really uncertain of what I would be committing to, or what the RWG would be committing to as the next phase of the task.
Well, why don't we just include in this submittal that we're tying a bow around what we've collected so far, but acknowledging it is so far, but we're submitting this with an expectation that the FAA will distill what we've provided and provide a more refined tasking to follow. And we're making it known that we're not closing the book on this issue. We're finishing this step in a longer process.
For example, I would see that a future step that the ComStack might be tasked to look at is depending upon the publication or release of their recommendations with regard to SNS and insurance and identification. Perhaps we would be asked to think through that aspect or engage, in that topic, just as a Yes, I can shop the dark.
I agree. I think the important thing is providing this feedback to FA now while they're working on advisory circulars. So once they get this feedback from ComStack, then they can include that in with all of the feedback they may be getting on the advisory circulars, and then come back with additional clarifying questions down the road.
Just to be clear, these are the recommendations, but the report will also
Yeah, this is a, what I would call a
summary.
very cursory summary, you know, like, because if I started pulling all of the recommendations from the report, we would have 20 slides. Right. Because there are such detailed recommendations with regard to edit.
There's 28 pages. So
Yes.
100 slides.
Is there anything more that would be helpful to you?
All right.
Is there anything more that would be helpful to you?
I was thinking about that, and I think we'll have to dig into the report to see, and I think, because I look at this, to me, it appears that ComStack has responded to our ask, take as far as he can take it. Ask for a look-see at our AC, how we might be able to improve that. The ComStack has done that at this point. Now, if the ComStack is saying, listen, you've taken a look, but we still have more work to do because we don't have it yet. Yeah, they don't piece of I to at this point, then there has to be an interim report, and we can say, well, continue the task until you get to the end. But it sounds like you're to the end at this point.
Right. I don't have people saying to me, if you give me one more week, I will send you, you know, significant inputs. I've collected the inputs that are available to me probably within the next, you know, 6 months to a year based on the feedback I got from people.
I think this, I mean, there's 6 recommendations here thereabouts. So there's things that I think take a look at these things that we need to enhance and improve KC in this kind of state. So I think there's things that request. I think this could be.
And we could add a recommendation here that is the FAA should, meaningfully evaluate the report, the full report being provided with detailed suggestions for modifications to AC 450.45-1.
And there's nothing preventing others from continuing to make comments directly.
Not at all. Not at all. And I will reiterate that if you have comments to the AC, please submit them, including if you submitted comments through the ComStack process. You can submit yours directly as an individual, as a company, as an academic, any of these things to any AC that is at the
Okay, I propose that we take a vote.
I was going to add, as an administrative matter, at 3:40, we do plan to discuss ComStack's recommendations for the FAA to task you for the fall meeting. So if there is something you do want to flag, let that be known to us, and we'll caucus, and then we'll have the tasking letter out late in May.
Okay, so we've got a motion and a second on the floor right now to move forward with this task and pass the recommendations with the understanding that the report will continue over the next couple of weeks just to finalize some of the.
Yeah, actually, I would say it's Tuesday. I would like to, any further feedback by the end of this week that I can incorporate and send on Monday.
Excellent. Okay. So if we're ready to take a vote, we'll do a roll call around the room, and then I'll call the folks online that I know of that are online, but other folks, members online, please speak up if I miss your name. Kate, I'll start with you. Aye. I'll vote yes. Aye. Ellie?
Aye.
Aye. Karen?
Yep.
Amanda?
Aye.
Dr. Niels? Aye. General Mercer?
Aye.
And then the folks online, Mike Moses?
Yep, vote aye.
Excellent. Matt Dunn? Dr. Parker?
Vote aye.
Anyone else any other members online?
I'm back here. See if that's all again. Vote aye.
Sure, right here.
Oh, I couldn't see those.
Yeah, come on up.
Please. Excellent. Okay, well, this recommendation or this task passes. I really appreciate all of your discussion here on this topic. And again, Karen, for your work, thank you so much for the excellent work done on this topic. We'd like to take a break until 10:45, and then we'll resume with the regular meeting. Welcome back. Hope you all enjoyed your break. We've got a couple more tasks we want to try to get through before our lunch break. So I'd like to turn the floor back over to Karen to walk us through task number 2.
Okay.
Thanks for coming back.
I needed more coffee. Okay, let's see, if I can get through this better than I'm getting through signing off the Wi-Fi. I think there's really a few I try while I'm otherwise involved. Okay, let's see. So working group 2, nothing big, just suggest fixes to specific 450 requirements. And a priority list was provided to, as noted here, to the committee. So circulated to the ComStack, but the list was characterized as the FAA's focus for the next Part 450 rulemaking is to provide more clarity and flexibility for applicants. Many of these changes would entail relatively minor changes throughout the entire part. The FAA's current thoughts on significant areas to address include the following. And because you don't have them in front of you, I'm actually going to just quickly kind of tick through. Reentry, operations of hybrid systems, license for single flight, means of compliance, methodologies, for safe flight safety analysis, alternatives to measuring high consequence events, hazard control strategies, system safety, definition of safety critical systems, flight safety systems, explosive sighting, and number 12, notification of a mishap. So just a few minor points of interest with regard to 450. So we can go to the next slide, findings. Note that the 450, the list that the FAA provided, focus areas does reflect, gratefully, many industry concerns regarding Part 450 regulations needing improvements, some of these being of high consequence, so to speak, and others being, I think a little bit more manageable appetizers, so to speak, to the main meal. And then I would say that one of the things that was noted was that almost half of the advisory circulars for the Part 450 regulations remain unpublished. That was something that folks want to make sure that we highlighted. And that of the various things, approval of means of compliance has been extremely difficult under Part 450. So that I consistently heard from folks that I received feedback on this. And again, as with the prior task, I did not limit inputs or requests for inputs to the RWG. I reached out to launch providers more broadly in the ComStack and to launch providers and operators that are applicants outside of ComStack. So people that are not members of ComStack interested in this topic to try and get some feedback to make sure that we were providing as thorough of a results report as possible. Any questions, comments on this? We could add a lot to this, but these were some of the key kind of consistent things that I heard in terms of what I could characterize as findings or observations. If you go either way. If not, we can.
I'm about to ask.
Of course.
Short conversation. So on the means of compliance, it's difficult. I'm curious. I've asked our team this question, and I like to ask ComStack to share what makes it so difficult, extremely difficult.
And I actually think that finding should say approval of means of compliance and methodologies. I realize in looking at this that word is missing from that, and that is a key other point, that those two pieces, which represent number 4 and number 5 on the list of priorities, were the two greatest pain points for people. So I think we should answer the question maybe for both of those.
Okay, sure.
So I'll open the floor for comments. And I'll also pull up the report so I can give you direct feedback that I received too.
I'm happy to share a little bit, Kelvin. So from our side, one of the things that we're looking for is making sure that the feedback that your team is providing is put into context with what requirement is not being met. specifically, because we're often told, well, you haven't met the requirements. Which one we're trying to identify that, so that we can either fix or correct whatever that incorrect or misunderstood means.
So it's ambiguity, a bit of ambiguity on our part, feedback they can give you. Respond specifically to
Yeah, it creates a bit of a do loop, right? Okay, this isn't enough, or we need something else, and we're asking for which exact requirement, or what is it that we haven't clarified or provided enough information on, and it's sort of these amorphous answers of like, well, generally, we just need more of this kind of info, or can you share more of that data? And it's not, the clarity is.
And the way that also translates into a pinch point for applicants is that in the pre-application phase leading up to what is considered to be a complete application is the level of detail required in order to get to complete enough to initiate review versus the iterative approach that's used up in the pre-app. And so how is that defined? Noted in the report is that industry is experiencing FAA requesting that the methods that will be used, but the inputs as well as select outputs. The pre-application review should be limited to the methodologies versus methodologies and the needs of compliance, like that's good. And then the other piece here was FAA should establish and track clear and transparent review timelines and feedback cycles or means of compliance in all aspects of the application review process, and that those should be consistent across applicants.
I think that's where the tools, just to tap on that last point, some of the tools and having a consistent way of sharing information back and forth with your team that denotes when things are submitted and what kind of feedback we're receiving on a timeline, and we can track all of that with you.
And then on the point with regard to methodology, it's a similar that the methodologies have not been the level of fidelity necessary with regard to the flight safety analysis methodologies. That those should be better defined by the FAA. More transparency is kind of a consistent thing here. And then one point that I thought was, that the regulations should track the level of analysis to the actual risk, right? Because, one of the things that I think, one of the reasons why there's interest in this discussion with regard to needs of compliance, looking at 415, 417, and a simpler process that may circumvent, so to speak, the methodologies requirement for test vehicles, and also particularly for smaller vehicles where the public safety risk is less than a larger vehicle. Of course, depending, right, if that were making an overly broad statement there, because that could not be true depending on what you're using as your propellant and your vehicle, of course. But and of course reliability most of the time. But that level of burden on the applicant does not result in a significant improvement or any improvement in some cases to public safety. It only results in cost for both the FAA and for the applicant with regard to resource time dedicated to navigating the regulations. So I think that was a piece that was point here. So those are the two, in terms of, and then reentry is consistently came up, so we have a limited, how should I characterize it? A smaller subset of the industry that's involved in reentry operations at this point. That N is not large. And so, however, for those companies that the 450, the following 454 reentry is particularly painful, right? So it's not something that everybody has experience with, but those who do feel very strongly about it and are really struggling with it. So I think that's another place where we
methodologies
with the methodologies, with some of the requirements in 450 that may or may not be like appropriately applicable to reentry. One of the areas that was, this was talked about when the rule was being developed and has consistently come up with reentry operators is the CEC challenges for reentry. That's extremely limiting for reentry vehicles. And it's new to Part 450, much less to reentry applicants. And then another piece was the limitation of using a flight history-based probability of failure for vehicles that have historically used a system safety method for determining the probability of failure. That shift in 450 away from what was done in 435, 431 is challenging. So again, an opportunity perhaps for means compliance, looking at the legacy regulations in order to make progress towards authorization of upcoming activities. Great.
Two bit of feedback that I can provide is so technical, but we work with a lot of contractors that support licensing processes, and they've provided to us that there seems to be a wide degree of varying degrees of experience based on the pre-app team that they get. Our pre-app team is amazing. I'll just put that out there, but it seems that some launch providers have gone through the process multiple times, and depending on the pre-app team that they get, it can drastically change what they experience.
So there's a very standard pre-app that you get.
I think
Fair characterization,
yeah, I think to be candid, I think there's it depends on the experience of the pre-app team. So if you get really seasoned from the FAA side, then it is more or less predictable. And then if the pre-app team includes folks that have recently joined, then there's a little bit more back and forth. I don't know the specifics, but when we sort of ask, okay, well, what's the timeline? Is it a statement of work? Generally it's, well, it depends on the pre-app team. There seems to be that dependency that we noticed.
While we're on the topic of pre-app, we did issue an AC discussing guide to complete and guide to complete application, December 18, 2023, PC 413.13-1. Did anyone experience using that yet, or do we have any input from this task team that was impacted by the AC publication system?
Yeah, so we didn't specifically look at that versus the other pieces, but I have had reason to look at the AC for pre-application and have certainly had other folks look at it. It's an interesting one because I think the AC is most helpful if you're not into the pre-application process, but it does not alleviate frustrations for people who are already in it and are in this back and forth iterative approach. So, it establishes some expectations, I would say. It doesn't mean that those expectations are well received. Yeah, and then because one of the things that I think we all are very supportive in my conversations, please, everybody, don't let me speak for you too much, is the seeking of solutions for having more transparency about where people are in the process. So, software solutions, tracking solutions, some kind of a management like CRM, like something that allows people to have some kind of transparency and understanding of what they are, as well as to the question that I asked Kelvin earlier today. Beyond here's what the process is, here's what a successful application looks like. Would be very helpful. To the point that Jay, I think, just aptly made, which is there are also a very limited number of people who can be hired to assist companies with licensing applications, right? For actually doing the analysis. In fact, there's only one company that has rights to the analytic capabilities to do the work. So companies otherwise could develop that in-house, right? License software and then develop the capabilities in-house. And capable company, and their results are variable, right? To Jay's point, you get an it depends, and they're not lawyers, which makes it very interesting. Rarely does an engineer tell you it depends. So yeah, so I think the report has feedback from across industry with regard to the various 12 pieces of this, and it's been circulated. It's only 5 pages, so and I would say that it also was taken in light of the report that was previously done by the regulatory working group in 2023 with regard to 450 recommendations. So, we didn't try to recreate the wheel. One of the aspects, so we can go to, we've got observations here. Any questions on these observations? So significant one there is them supporting and the 450 Spark. So I think that's a really important aspect in engaging with the industry to develop clear recommendations for changes to 450 that would be made. And looking at the ACs, significant typos and aspects that fail to provide clarity. Those are words that come from submissions that are received in the report, and a concern that those who have submitted comments haven't seen the updates published to those advisory circulars to date, which one of the things that creates is a disparity among applicants. So if an applicant is, first looking at an advisory circular that's published on the FAA's website, it will have to experience that advisory circular through its application process to realize the challenges with that advisory circular that another applicant may have already experienced and worked through with the FAA. So you create a disparity as somebody is trying to do their work, looking at the advisory circular in an independent way that is devoid of the learning that has already occurred that the FAA has not adjusted, that hasn't been adjusted in the AC. So that also goes to just general transparency again, like the learnings from one applicant aren't reflected in some way within the FAA that could then show, I guess, pave the way a little bit more for others. And so yes, and then FAA's approach to means of compliance. Again, these all reflect new observations that were made and unclear what metrics play into means of compliance approval. Any questions here? So these are meant to be things that were observed or commented on, and then we have recommendations to follow and report. If not, we can move to the next slide.
I actually have a question.
Okay.
It may not be totally relevant at this juncture, but just to open it up to the committee. It seems that the 450 provides a framework for a lot of creativity, but in practice, I'm not sure if that's possible. There's sort of a practicality that needs to be considered in commercial launches, and I wonder if, because I feel like for several years the feedback from industry has been we need more clarity, but I wonder if it's not so much clarity, but the framework needs to be adjusted to provide a really specific path to licensing, as opposed to the current one where the context is you do all of these things, X, Y, and Z, to get a license. But in practice, whether it's because of resources or launch schedule or otherwise, those unique approaches can't really lead to a launch license. At least for us, most of our launch missions are 24-month contracts. So, in practice, we can come up with our own flight safety analysis methods, methodologies, but the amount of technical interchange it would require for us to kind of anchor that approach, it's impractical. So it kind of leads to using a proven flight safety tool or or a method that, or a means of compliance that's well characterized already. So the framework should be adjusted to just say, this is how you should approach this. And then having that back and forth or react phase where you're exploring all these unique methods, but really at the end of it, you're all going to kind of arrive at the same approach. And so maybe that could be really helpful. Be thinking out loud.
I think, Jay, what you're speaking to is one of the things that I identify in that is the idea of, we do see defaulting to more traditional approaches and this idea that if you follow 415, 417 or, the legacy launch and or reentry licenses, shouldn't that be a known, tried and true approach to getting to a license, right? And that we have perhaps moved to regulations that are a bit beyond or far afield of where we are as an industry in terms of the development. And I think about that in terms of both the resources that are at hand, right? So a startup company like yours, trying to design and prepare for your mission, and then having to dedicate the resources to a Part 450 it's not insignificant. Whereas if you start with something that is a known, traditional approach to the regulations, then perhaps that is a path that you want to start down with maybe transitioning to this broader operators approach later as you expand the envelope of your capabilities and your experience in-house. I think I have heard from the FAA that that's something that, to the point about can you use the legacy regulations as a means of compliance, and just saying if you follow these, then you could get a license, is essentially what I hear you saying would potentially work, because at the end, that's almost where you end up by virtue of what what the FAA knows, and what is the art of the possible in the time frame and with the resources that you have to dedicate to the problem.
Correct. Yeah, so it's 450 framework already sort of allows, leads to that. It just takes a couple of years to get to that, and lots of significant resources.
Yes.
Really, truly very significant. And so, and then the other, or why my mind was going here is that once you establish sort of a very well-defined sort of narrow path to licensing, there are opportunities for optimization to kind of alleviate some of the resource constraints for processing lots of applications. So I think that's, as an engineer, that's where my mind goes.
Right.
I want a very predictable process so that I can start automating, bits of it and writing code and other things. So
we kind of have a perfect storm, I think, that we're facing right now, which is, a change in regulations that not everybody is comfortable and familiar with, a significant ramp up in the number of operators and the launch activities, one that we've all been hoping for, right? So, and the lack of experience and resources on the operator side at the same time that they're trying to, we have an increased number both there and of the operation, and then the FAA also trying to ramp up its knowledge and ability to implement the regulation, as well as its resources to address the demand from industry. So, you couldn't really put together a more challenging scenario, because if the number of applicants were 1 or 2 and you were implementing new regulations, then you could handhold a lot more, and everybody could figure this out together the way that we did, for example, with figuring out how you did reusable launch vehicles under an ELV license structure, years ago when there weren't that many people trying to do that. But now we have a lot of entities trying to get through our licensing with, a constraint that is not just there's resource constraint on both sides and regulatory constraints because of the challenges with implementing these regulations. So, there are a lot of reasons why this is a very important topic.
I'll just add one more last thing to advocate a little bit for what we're working on, which is sort of that responsive space launch capability.
Yeah.
So on the defense side is tactical, but I think with the like sort of the constellations getting built out and really, we're starting to rely on it in like commercially meaningful way. If one of those satellites need to be replaced or repaired in orbit, then every second there's revenue lost. And so I think being able to respond quickly to repair it and the infrastructure is going to be sort of key. And I think if we want to go fast and not cut corners, it's got to be, you know, a pretty rigid, specific process. And so I think that's what add to just mentioned as well, so that how we get faster without cutting corners.
Okay, so we have the recommendations, we've circulated the report to members. Any other questions or further discussion that we want to have? Anything else anybody wants to highlight?
Karen, is there, to your point, both your points about following the old model, right? So Calvin answered that it should fit, right? I think theoretically, if he does, it should fit. Do we need to say something about that? Is there an implementation aspect of that we need to be recommending that we haven't touched on, or did we get into that last time?
So I think we have something in the report, sorry. Immediately. I think that this is an important piece. So, I mean, I would be happy to make sure that we have, you know, that reflected in the report. I think there's something in there on this, on terms of the means of compliance and a way to address that. But I certainly am supportive of acknowledging and making sure that one of our recommendations is that the FAA continue to pursue opportunities that would, you know, that would facilitate single launch approvals based on legacy regulations that as a means of compliance.
So
I don't know someone else wants to jump on.
Not on that, I have one separate one.
Oh yeah, I have a different one too. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, I was just gonna, and I think this is captured in the report, Karen, about the FAA and DoD regulatory overlaps. I know that's something that you guys have been working on for many years, Calvin, and the team continues to make progress, but we'd really love to see a consistency between FAA and DoD on how we can prevent delays for commercial operators when we're using some of the methods and inputs provided by the range, right? So when we're operating on the range and using their ground safety analysis, we want to make sure that that can be applicable to our licenses for the flight safety analysis portions, that those two would seamlessly come together.
I was actually going to ask a question that related to that. In the report, we have the recommendations around the ranges that they work on standard operating procedures. And I was sort of interested in, for the folks who face this, how does that usually, what's sort of the magic that happens now that lets that sort of gets through that hump? Is it just the right person gets involved, or is it the range, you know, here versus the FAA? How does that, acknowledging that there's something to be fixed here, sort of what's the difference between a quick answer and a long answer now?
So a quick answer, one point to make about what you just asked is person and people.
Yeah.
And this goes to Jay's comment about getting the right person. You know, there have been people that have been staffed in these roles that are incredible. And if you can tap into that person's knowledge and understanding and experience, then you're off to the races. And then, you know, and when that person leaves, then we are all at a loss for being able to accomplish what we want to accomplish in the same time frames, because, you know, again, these have been in some cases like more singular activities for many, you know, years. And the range kind of had a wealth of knowledge and experience, you know, and recognize that the FAA has looked to recruit people that have, you know, Space Force experience, NASA experience, et cetera. and then also people that are those people in the FAA, which are really important. So one of the issues that I think has come up here, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, is anybody else, of course, is that on the legacy regulations, part 415, part 417, were largely based on the range requirements in 91.710. And so, the Space Force, then Air Force, was very familiar with those requirements, and they did a lot of the analysis, and still do analysis for applicants. So, an applicant would rely on the range to do their flight safety analysis, to do ground safety, etc. Under Part 450, the regulations were different than 91.710. 91.710 was not performance-based. It was directive. And so 450 being performance-based, there's a delta there that is significant. And so there have been cases, to my understanding, where an applicant has worked with the range to develop analysis or data or information, and then has had to then taken that information to the FAA, and it has been a challenge to have that then convert into a 450 approach, or answer the 450 mail. And then the question is, well, we need the method by which the range developed this capability. Well, we've always trusted the range to develop this analysis, so why do we now? So there's been some backwards, and I think some of that, has been worked through as it has come up, but the who is responsible for what, this issue of standard operating procedures and authorities, and how that would work through the 450 licensing process is something that has been a challenge for applicants. Megan, did I characterize that correctly? Jay?
I wholeheartedly agree with that, because we are experiencing that as we speak. And so, but I didn't really understand the part about SOPs. Sorry, did I really miss that part of the book?
Standard operating procedures?
Yeah, but sorry, why was that brought up?
Oh, because I would say that under the legacy, and John, you guys have experience with this too. Under the legacy operation, we all knew who was responsible for what and how things worked, and now we have to tell you mapping, right? So I think of it in terms of like mapping the responsibilities, and so once we took 417, 450 and said 450, it didn't map quite to the ranges approach, and so that the standard operating procedures, I would say, is a stand in there for the idea that we need to bridge that gap with clear guidance on who's responsible for what and how these things match each other.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I'll add a little startup launch company perspective. So when you, at least on the defense missions, there's varying degrees of mission assurance requirements, whether it's category 1 or 2. And as often as part of that mission assurance, there's quite a bit of requirements regarding range safety requirements, as well as the licensing. And for example, when you're at a commercial launch site, there's this, they don't have like 91, or even sort of NASA equivalent of that. It kind of messes up the mission assurance that's been employed for decades, because there's lots of range requirements, and in the absence of range requirements at a commercial launch site, it kind of throws everybody off. And so I think that's worth just considering. How can FAA sort of bridge that gap if like a commercial launch site doesn't have a range that's established?
Yeah, and I'll note that there are some operators that still look to the federal range capabilities to contract with them for analysis, and to the extent that that's available to them.
Yeah, and any insight is hopefully helpful, so it's not just providing it, but larger launch companies have being on past experience and handling data that the launch providers really did that sort of have that benefit in particular to satisfy mission assurance requirements. So like in the absence of a range, you can say, well, we operated out of Cape or whatever. Here's what we use, and then the government customer can sort of review that and approve that. But in the absence of that, kind of as a launch startup, you gotta get pushed to an established range. So it's not, the commercial launch sites really aren't an option in practice, especially if you're on government contracts that require rigor. And then as far as my understanding, and I could be completely wrong here, like a totally commercial mission out of a completely commercial launch site, I don't think that's been demonstrated to date, other than maybe like Alaska or something like that. So, or like some private spaceports. So I think that's something there, 450 that compete. Or maybe it's like an interagency collaboration.
This issue is further exacerbated when you go from the DoD ranges, which is what you guys are talking about, versus the NASA range up at Wallops. It's further exacerbated there because NASA Wallops wants to duplicate or redo the safety analysis and the work that's done when a customer goes directly to the FAA to work. So the customer, and of course they want the customer to pay for that too. So, we struggle with our lift providers that come in this fight between the NASA Wallops Flight Facility and roles and responsibilities. Who has responsibility for flight safety? And if that indeed is the FAA, then why is NASA redoing or duplicating that work? It's a different scenario even than what you face at the DoD ranges. We're struggling with that, and we are hoping that that 450 will help resolve some. We have come with the FAA support, ASD particularly. We do have a clear reading now from the FAA that the Virginia Spaceport is indeed a commercial spaceport. It happens to sit on federal land, but it is a commercial spaceport. That designation was tough and long time coming, but it allows us to operate a little bit differently than if it was a DoD facility or a federal government facility. But it's depending upon where you go, you got different sets of challenges as a lift.
We've got some folks online that have questions. Matt, go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Sorry I'm not there in person. But on this point, I just wanted to add, two or three thoughts. The first is with respect to ground side safety at federal ranges. Completely agree with Megan and others that there needs to be a streamlined way for the FAA with respect to commercial launches to accept range safety for ground operations and not have licensees go through an additional process for that. And fundamentally, I think the challenge here is really a disconnect between the range and AST with respect to the processes and agreement among those two parties as to what is safe. So I think the best thing the government could do at this point is to have a conversation with itself to come to an agreement that as it relates to range safety at federal facilities, if the range has approved either NASA or the Space Force an operator's ground system that meets the requirement under Part 450, and we can streamline this entire process. And I think that's a government-to-government agreement that could be emphasized and resolved in relative short order and take away the confusion and uncertainty that operators have, and also minimize the amount of licensing work that has to take place, both on the operator and the FAA side. Second observation I would make is one of the key challenges I've observed as it relates to Part 450 is the process through which methodologies are agreed to by the FAA. And one of the challenges here, and I know the FAA has begun to go after this and get behind it, is the lack of transparency associated with the Common Standards Working Group, for example, where historically that has been like a government-focused group, where the only representatives on that panel are NASA, FAA, and the Space Force, which was great when the universe of launch sites and launch operators was principally government. But this is changing, and I think there needs to be an increase in the amount of transparency with the CSWG as to its historic methods and its historic approaches to safety issues. And I think there probably needs to be a restructuring of that organization or that group to include industry with representation and voting capabilities. And so there can be a more fulsome and modernized way to evaluate and advocate for and promote updated methodologies for achieving public safety outcomes, both for flight safety analysis, but also for ground safety and other types of methodologies that are currently done. So I just wanted to add those to the discussion.
I think pulling on that same thread about the CSWG is what their authorities really are, right? They're in my mind, they're an advisory or a body that recommends but can't enforce. So the question becomes, okay, do they really have real relevance? If they can't, if they recommend something and a organization or a lift provider decides that they don't want to adhere to that, they have no way or means to enforce that. So that's another aspect of it. If you're going to expand it, as my colleague said, and I don't disagree with what he said, I think it should be, but you got to put some kind of authority into it where they've got some teeth. Otherwise, it's just somebody making a suggestion.
Do we have any other questions or comments on the recommendations for 50 task? Take a vote to close this task out.
Motion? So moved.
Abigail.
Got a second from Julie.
Excellent. So we're prepared to take a roll call vote. I just want to make sure no one else has any questions. No one else online has questions or comments? Okay. Julie seconded. Excellent. Let's go back around the room. So Kate? Aye. Dale?
Aye.
Marva?
Aye.
John?
Aye.
Jay?
Aye.
I'll vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Emily? Aye. Aye. Gary?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Dr. John Mercer. And then folks online, we've got Matt Dunn,
Yes.
Mike Moses,
Vote aye.
Michelle Parker. Anyone else online that I may have missed? The other ComSec members? Excellent. For 50 tasks, recommendations passed. Thank you so much again to the regulatory working group for all of your excellent work on both of these tasks. Really appreciate it. Karen, get you a little breather. Yeah. But we definitely have more tasks to move on. So we'd like to cover the safety working group tasks next before we take a break for lunch. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mike Moses. And just a quick comment. So I did hear from some folks online that the microphones in this room tend to pick up everything noise, so just be mindful of that as you're crinkling your water bottles and things. Thanks.
Hey, Karina, thanks. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. All right, well, we'll cover the safety working group tasks. We had 2 taskers this time, and let me start off by saying thank you to all the great support we got from the safety working group. Myself, co-chair Dr. Michelle Parker, Matt Dunn, John Elbin, Tony Frago and Melanie Strickland. Plus, I think a lot of folks actually donated a lot of time from their support staff to help us with all the various reviews that we've done. So thank you for all of that. It's been the team's been great. So really great things. We had two tasks. They basically review a recent update to the recommended practices for human occupant safety, and then a related one, which was looking at industry consensus standards as they apply to safety. And so before I go into the details, I just want to say, I think our observation here on the first slide kind of sums it up. We're going to talk much more about the process maybe than the document. I think the regulatory working group had a huge heavy lift on two very meaty topics. And while these safety tasks were fairly meaty, they are very, very late in the process. And a lot of other things have been occurring, specifically with respect to the 460 Spark, which have kind of really made a lot of things out of order. So the observation here is what we're actually not doing today is going through a detailed line-by-line report on this 2023 document that was just issued, because it really kind of got itself out of order, right? We, as industry, did not get a chance to provide input ahead of time before its release, and doing a detailed line-by-line right now without a corresponding philosophical tie together to how this matches up with what is occurring in 460 Spark, or how regulatory compliance might be moving forward in the future, really got a little disjointed. So we felt it was more important to give general philosophy feedback and a recommendation along that line rather than a detailed report of the document itself. So that's the main observation. I think if we go to the next slide, I'll cover the findings. I'll give a couple examples as we go, and then we can have a good discussion if we need to, and the group wants to. But I would say, just kind of going back on that, right? We had given safety working group, this is my second ComStack turn. I've been on safety working group both times. And about 2 years ago, we had teed up what was going to be basically this task, is updates to this document, which was originally issued back in 2014. And as it was moving into the idea of learning period expiration and the start of a Spark, last year would have been a great time to tackle this tasker. Where we could have gone in and given guidance and direction on philosophy and purpose and intent. So as it stands now, the document is basically a collection of things brought from other sources, which is fine. It's not meant to be regulatory or binding. It's meant to be best practices. But it kind of tackles, I think, head on an issue that we see in a few other places, specifically the RAND report that was commissioned about a year ago also hits this. Is occupant safety a standalone set of design requirements and regulations, or is it in addition to existing regulations? And I think we all believed it was the latter. This would be supplemental to things like 450. However, this best practices document and other sources really start to tackle things that are what you would call fundamental of spacecraft design in the first place: program management, configuration management, system safety analysis, manufacturing, quality, things that apply whether there are humans in the ship or not, and doesn't specifically call out where those things need to be beefed up because there are humans in the ship. And that was very confusing to most of us and potentially misleading, especially to new applicants. Are these practices being recommended in addition to? Because there are certain ones that are in fairly good conflict with 450. Right now, or in addition to 450, and don't exist without a lot of clear reasoning as to why. And again, this document, a recommended best practices document, is certainly not the place to have that discourse or debate or set a direction by the FAA. But we felt in the ComStack Safety Working Group that this was probably also not the right forum to have that debate in this document. And so we chose not to engage into a detailed line-by-line analysis of that. So this is not that detailed red line. So at a high level, vehicle safety is actually human safety. Those two things go hand in hand. And we felt it would be important to specifically cover what's unique about having humans on board. But the very first part of this document makes it very clear this document does not cover medical criteria or ionizing radiations, the space environment, two of the things that are probably the biggest drivers to human occupant safety, other than restraint systems and G-forces. And so this document actually doesn't cover a lot of that human safety aspect. So it seems like there's a missing section there. and I'm sure there are good reasons not to cover it. It's being covered in other areas, but a document by itself without the philosophy of how this document's planned to be used in a broader sense by AST got us a little on our back foot. So the other piece is the second recommendation, talking about the content is prescriptive and not consistent. It basically collects from a lot of different sources, multiple sources, including NESA's 1130, which are sometimes applicable and sometimes not, and without the context of why they're being applied, with no concept of a design reference mission by which an operator can decide which pieces of a document would apply or not apply, or which best practices would apply or not apply, also caused some confusion, specifically probably to new applicants in human occupant safety. And then finally, these findings basically kind of led us to the content that it's not really sure how this is meant to be used. And with conversations happening currently in parallel in 460 Spark conversations, we felt the recommendation on the next page, if you want to go to the next page, would be that it would be good to have that conversation first in context of how these things all tie together, rather than providing feedback in isolation. Some of us and some of us in the safety working group have either fellow members from our industry that are parts of the Part 450 Spark, or are definitely not. And so there was a mix of folks who know what's happening in 460 and those who don't. And it seemed like we were about to set up two redundant paths here on human occupant safety, and that did not seem like a good thing to be doing for AST. So we came to this recommendation, which is, while this document is a good collection of a lot of different inputs, we should have a discussion on the scope of what this entails before we give any future guideline and revisions. We could do that as part of 460, or it could occur outside of that. But basically, after that initial 460 Spark work is complete, I think is a good time to come in and try to deconflict multiple paths. The last bullet was just, until that occurs, just be recognizing that the intent of this best practices document could steer new and existing entrants a little astray. There is definitely a sentence in the introduction that says this is not binding or regulatory, but it can add some confusion to the thing. So duplicative work, and while each of the participants in the safety working group have gone through this document and probably do have individual feedback and red lines, we just didn't see the value in providing that as an input here, because it would be a lot of work that would potentially be immediately overcome by events. So not maybe the recommendation or the work that FAA was expecting out of the safety working group, but we felt that by not being able to give us our inputs ahead of time onto a document that's already been released, we didn't see a lot of value given where we were at this moment in time here in April of 2024. So I kind of went through that pretty fast, but let me open that up. Any other members of the safety working group have any specifics that they want to add to that context? Okay. All right. So that's basically our proposal. Is there's a lot here. It's kind of a collection of input, and it really potentially is either in conflict or could become duplicative to what's happening over in the 460 Spark. So we didn't feel there was much value in providing details until we had a chance to have discussion. So our recommendation, the specific recommendation, would be for AST to host a discussion with industry, and would suggest ComStack would be a good place to start on exactly how these guidelines come together as it relates to Spark. So that's our recommendation for task number 3, which was reviewing the 2023 best practices document. Any other comments or discussion for the group?
Do we want to take a vote on these recommendations?
Karine, if you want, the next one kind of is simple, and we could, if you just want to have one vote, I could cover task 4 at the same time.
Sounds great.
Okay, so next slide on task 4, I think also became an overcome by events. This was actually a recommendation as a future tasker that we had provided as a safety working group about a year ago, which would be to look at other industry frameworks that use industry consensus standards to help draw similarities to how the commercial space industry might use similar frameworks. Since then, the Spark has already kicked off on 460, and I believe is looking at exactly these topics as well. And to avoid the duplicative work there as well, we basically recommend this task be rolled into the Spark. So in combination between tasks 3 and 4, I guess the ask of AST is for direction. If you want ComStack to give input on these 2 tasks separate from 460, I think we need to be really specific and then probably understand the value that that would actually yield, given the specific industry representation that has been incorporated into 460, the 460 Spark. And so that's kind of set us up as these 2 tasks as written kind of potentially became duplicative, and we probably require further direction if we want to go further, and then justification as to why we would do separate efforts there rather than similar efforts. So with those 2 on the table, we can discuss that or move to a vote. They're very similar in our recommendation.
Move approval of both safety recommendations.
Anyone have any comments on the second task?
Yeah, I do. I don't think the 460 Spark is cast. I think duplicative. Question. I think what I hear Mike saying is just duplicative work because the 460 Spark is doing that. I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the 460 Spark is tasked.
It's becoming, I think it's in the nature of the sort of exploring paths, it's becoming, it's a lot of time being spent to learn that. So I think it's happening whether organically or directly.
We haven't seen what the 460 Spark is going to produce yet. So the question that we posed to the ComStack, I believe, was a legitimate question, not knowing what's going to Spark.
And so I actually, that's a great point. I actually think, right, and Mike, to your point and to what safety working group comes here, I don't think there should be an impression that sort of there was anyone's at fault sort of about this timing, right? I think that there was, recommended, the concept was interested in looking at this, right? At some point, there was some transition going on. There was different, right? There was sort of timelines overlap for when tasks kind of finally came out the door versus when 460 took off. So I think it's important that, at least from my perspective, I don't think there's any negative intent sort of in how this played out. I think it just played out the way it did for different reasons.
Yeah, Mike, totally. The timing of that was totally duplicative. And Kelvin, maybe to your point is, I think what we found as we were talking within our industry reps, it was very difficult to tell what 460 Spark was working on and not. There were hints of potentially duplicative work. There might not have been. So there wasn't a lot of synergy. And I think the collective feedback from all of us was we needed to come back to AST to say, you probably know best where there is duplication or not. Before we spent a fair bit of effort on this document, please give us more confirmation that it's either not duplicative and therefore worthy or is worthless or be overcome. So that's that. I think the one part I will be a little stronger on. So as it relates to the Spark, totally understand the timing. I personally, and as the safety working group rep that's been here for a while, really wish we would have had a chance to give input on this document before it was published. That's about a year ago type of feedback. So from today's purposes, I won't harp on that anymore. And I know we've talked about that in the past, but that is one thing that it would have been good to get industry input prior to publishing this document. But that water's under the bridge. We're now on the new effort here, which is the 460 thing. So yeah, if FAA wants to come back and say, here's how we're delineating the work between these 2 work streams, ComStack, we want your input on this specific thing, I think we'd be willing to take that on as a task. But for now, we felt it was just not worth our time if it was going to not be incorporated.
Mike, thank you for that. I do want to just say this, Brian Berna. We did intentionally ask ComStack this question, knowing the Spark 460 was going on, as if this would roll into another input from industry from a different angle, and we would consider that. And this is also in the public setting versus the Spark activity, which is in more of a proprietary setting. But we have the co-chair of the Spark 460 here, Dr. Ben Nguyen, who would like to make a few comments.
Good morning, everyone. Ben Nguyen, government co-chair for Spark 460. So appreciate the input. I just want to emphasize on what Calvin's observation is that this task force as task to ComStack is not one of the 3 objectives that we formulated as a charter, as official tasking for the SPARK 460. We have 3 objectives with SPARK 460. One is to figure out the scope for human spaceflight regulatory framework. Second is to focus on developing the framework itself. And the third is to figure out the financial impact to industry. So this one is definitely not on it, but it could be a derived recommendations coming out of the SPARK that we don't know just yet. So we're gonna have to wait and see. Any recommendations and input provided from ComStack can be used for discussion and shared with the SPARK 460, but not vice versa, because ComStack is a contact committee and SPARK is a closed forum rulemaking committee. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate that. I think the difference is on the non-government side, those of us in industry, we don't have a lot of resources to bifurcate and split our work up. And so for us to do duplicative effort on a 460 support and a ComStack support that goes separately, it just takes a lot of work from us. So I think appreciating the clarification of exactly what you'd be looking for from Brian from the AST would be good if we're going to reissue a task like this. So that so industry can better assign its resources. We're all, as we just talked about with the regulatory working group, it takes a lot of work and there are very few experts in industry who can help with these things.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I'm curious from your perspective, or maybe someone else in the room. I personally am not very involved in the ASTM 27 effort, but just curious if this sort of topic is being discussed at all at ASTM.
So as it relates to task 4, ASTM is definitely working towards these industry consensus standards. I think when we proposed this task, it was at least a year ago. It was just prior to that being ready to move forward, as we were talking about the learning period extensions and what would constitute industry consensus standards as a benchmark of how other industries use that. So at the time, ASTM hadn't tackled it. I don't believe they picked that particular challenge up in the last year, but they are moving forward with just the current standards that are on the docket for them to review. Someone else might have a little more detail than me and been more involved in the last 6 months or so of ASTM.
Not on ASTM question, but just as may have been evident in talking about the SNS task and my challenge with characterizing what happened in the SPARK. To Mike's point, because entities who are close to this topic are also representatives, people, humans, are also involved in that SPARK, it becomes really challenging, I think, to know what to say in this forum, because that discussion, in an effort to protect the discussions in that forum, if we're repeating them here, are we revealing what's happening in SPARK? I'm not on the 460 SPARK, so, and I think there's a lot of work that's happening there. So I just want to also note that there's that human element of being thoughtful about, okay, what am I saying in this realm while we're still cogitating on it in another? And so how do we have effective conversations where we're not just bringing the 460 SPARK to the table because it's the same people? I think that's something I can just guess at is a challenge they're facing, because I just faced it in trying to think about how I commented thoughtfully about the insurance issues with SNSs and how we talked about it in a report that's not public with regard to 440.
Questions or discussion on this? Anyone else online?
I have one more thought on this, the frameworks piece here, which is that I think if we wanted to pursue this task, I mean, one of the things that we could, do here is to tap into other expertise, and I 460 SPARK may be doing this, but into other, other expertise that are in other agencies or even within this agency and within the FAA. That use consensus standards, because there are lots of them. I think that one of the interesting points of discussion here that I have an idea about but have no evidence to support, so it's just a hypothesis, is that where industry consensus standards are more uniformly or consistently used as a means of compliance for performance-based safety requirements, that those correlate, that there's a correlation to the maturity of the industry. But that's just my hypothesis. And so that, I mean, as we're trying to think about this for our industry, that might be a lesson learned from other industries, is that there's something about the maturity of the industry and the level of experience with the industry that might have correlation there. Again, hypothesis without proof.
Seems like certainly over time we would evolve based on experience.
Right.
I mean, you can start out with something and the expectation that would evolve with experience.
It's almost like a causation.
Right. Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and then let me, if you guys don't mind going back just a couple slides to the findings on task 3 for a second. Just one thing to make sure we don't, I went past it pretty fast and I probably want to make sure I emphasize it. So can you go back 2 slides? Finding number 1 there. Let me just expand a little bit and maybe repeat myself. When you read this document, when you read the RAND report from last year, or even the Aerospace Corporation recommendations, it gets very fuzzy very quickly. This concept of, there's a lot of stuff listed in these reports. They're not regulations yet, right? They're not direction, but it's hard for us in industry to tell, is this the direction the FAA is going to head? Which is adding a bunch of things which are, while very good practices for spacecraft design, are not at all unique to the fact that there are humans on board. And so is human occupant safety meant to be a wrapper that goes around only the things that are there because humans are on board? Or is it meant to be, if I take it to its extreme, an entirely new set of things that drop on spacecraft design because humans are on board? I don't think that's what anybody intends, but it is getting hard to tell. For example, the very first observation, the very first thing in this recommended best practices document is a section on cybersecurity and how you have to have protection for systems from being compromised online, which should apply to no matter whether you have humans on board or not. If it was specifically talking about making sure your medical data or things like that couldn't get hacked, that would make sense, but it's very generic. It's just talking about cybersecurity. Then there's an entire section on configuration management and how you should track changes to your vehicle. Again, should be applied whether there are humans on board your ship or not. And so that would be a thing I'd ask of clarification from AST, of direction of philosophy as to whether for 60 Spark recommended best practices, whatever the documents are as they relate to human occupant safety, are they meant to be in addition to all other things, or standalone documents by themselves? And it's getting fuzzy. They're starting to appear to be more standalone, and that's going to lead to confusion in industry. And when we get to regulation, add to confusion in licensing. So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that one out again.
Mike, along those lines, I mean, that seems, I would support a recommendation that, you know, revisions or attempts to capture recommended practices for spaceflight occupant safety should be focused on the occupant safety, the safety of that occupant, would be the recommendation that I would derive from that and support and share your observation as noted here in terms of that document.
That's a good, yeah, I wish I would have thought of that last week.
Yeah, so Mike, this is Brian again, just to address your concern. Best practices are just that, best practices, good things to consider when building things that will carry people. If you look at the other side of the FAA, we regulate the safety of the vehicles because they carry people. Now there's unmanned aircraft. We don't ensure the mission assurance of that unmanned aircraft delivering pharmaceuticals to your grandmother. We ensure that that thing is under control and it doesn't land on someone's head on the ground. So similar concept in the commercial space realm is where we ensure that no rocket pieces fall on humans' heads. But now if there's someone on that vehicle, it's special. It's more special now. That's what the Human Safety Authority piece that we have a learning period tied to. would allow NFA to do is to consider that as a system as a whole to ensure occupant safety. No matter if it was a maintenance error, things being refurbished on the ground, whether it's a flight crew error, whether it's an operator error from an unmanned rocket from the ground, all those things have to be considered as a system that could affect someone on board that spacecraft. So that is the intent of the recommended practice.
So what you're saying, Brian, is if this document was just going to be a delta, cover the things you need to human being on board, there has to be some other document that is delta covers all the general. Other documents.
No, we handle public safety today. So there is no other document. We don't regulate
There's not a
safety of
place
people on
where-
board.
Yeah,
Not
but I
a
understand, I
place
think,
where
but this
it's
gets to
as
where
such.
the spark is headed, right? And the potential of duplicative efforts. If we could spend a lot of time making this a delta, but there is no document we're deltaing it off of, right? So that's, do you want ComStack to give you recommended best practices, assuming we're doing everything? You know, occupant safety, public safety, basic spacecraft design safety, or is it just meant to be the delta? I think we all think it's meant to be the delta, but without the base document, it's really hard to tell where's 460 going. So that's why these two things kind of become one at some point. I know this task is just on a best practices document, and we've taken this much broader than that. So my apologies for that, but I think it is a good philosophical discussion to have.
I also think that's an interesting point, Brian, that you raised, which is what you're saying is what I'm distilling from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when we move to humans on board, we are no longer in a public safety only posture. We're in a full mission assurance posture.
If the learning period expires.
Right, but when we move to the FAA regulating, that it's a full mission assurance, full vehicle, it's not just about the humans and their interaction with the vehicle. It's a full human rated vehicle that the FAA will oversee.
That's what that means.
Okay.
I've got a question to Mike, to what Mike was saying. So you mentioned there is definitely a coupling between spacecraft development processes and then human occupant safety. And acknowledging that, Mike just mentioned two paradigms where one paradigm is wrapper for occupant specific safety related, and then the other is just broad wrapper on the entire vehicle. How does that, just philosophically speaking, how does that look different in practice? Like those two paradigms? Does it end up looking the same, even though, since there is a tight coupling between the development and safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll give you my opinion, then we should let other folks weigh in. I have trouble seeing the difference between those two, and they become very blurred. Where a part falls on the ground and impacts the public safety, if that part was critical to the safety of the occupants on board, vehicle safety is human occupant safety at that point, right? So ensuring that those things don't occur. The very specific part would be where it lands on the ground and the safety of the people that it may or may not be impacting. But the fact that if it was an unintentional part or whatever, right, the vehicle has to have been safe in the first place. And so those get very balanced to the concept of it's a total mission assurance concept if humans are on board. I mean, the reality is it's that way anyway, because, the things that could affect, just take manufacturing quality as an example. If I have a manufacturing quality defect that causes something to then increase public safety risk, it is extremely likely that it is also impacting my occupant safety risk or has the same potential to impact. So control over quality processes, configuration management, cybersecurity, program management processes, the SMS that you would use, all of that seems as if it is as applicable to public safety as it is to human occupant safety. And so in my opinion, those things are very blurred and become one at that point. So I view things that would be human occupant safety, best practices, regulation, standards to be deltas. In addition to all of that, here are extra things you should do.
Thank you.
That's my opinion.
Since I made my motion, we've had a lot of conversation. Is my motion the same, or do I need to amend it? I think it's the
So
same.
the two recommendations on the table were basically that we wanted further direction. You could sum them up. I'll paraphrase, right? Further direction if detailed responses are needed from ComStack, or have conversations about how these things dovetail with existing work, potentially in the 460 Spark. So that would be the recommendations here that are on the table right now. I think Karen proposed that we could add one on the fly, which specifically talks about a recommendation that what we just talked about is human occupant safety should be phrased or couched in terms of it is in addition to the vehicle safety or the public safety. We could, if we're going to do that one on the fly, I'd have to spend a few minutes to work out the specific wording. So we don't have to approve that one if you don't want to.
I guess I'll stick with my
Yeah, I think the original
Okay.
is probably the best in that case.
I'm good with that.
We don't
Unless
want
we want to make.
to add what Karen suggested.
What do you think? I mean, I guess we have to fold that in.
So I think it was answered, right? I think there's something to think about I think it's interesting the difference in sort of expectations of what the answer was. I don't know what to do about that right now, but it seems like there's probably something we need to.
Yeah, but I think it goes to the point that John was making about if we're gonna have this conversation and Mike as well about recommended practice for spaceflight participant occupant safety, that we need to be clear on what that delta is and what we're baselining. And so it's yeah, but I'm not sure that we have to, I don't know if we have to tackle that today or if that is kind of part of an ongoing work for the task, for the working group. I'm certainly not looking to give anybody any more work as somebody who has taken on more than I do think that there's and I think that the revision or retraction, you know, we're covering it in these recommendations. So I would almost say it's like a sub-bullet to the recommendation that's there as the revision or retraction piece. So it's, I think I could argue that we're covered. I'm arguing that we are covered in efforts to not create more work.
And we can elaborate on that a little bit more, Mike, in the white paper.
No, I think that's fine. I don't think it's strong enough to make a recommendation here, but I think as if we roll it into future taskers, we should definitely have that part of the conversation.
So then, yes, Dale, I think your original motion.
I'll second Bill's motion.
All right, let's call for final comments. Take a vote.
Can I just take 1 minute to just digest everything?
All right, we'll go around the room. If you guys could just state your vote as we go around. Start with Keith. Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
And then folks online, Mike Moses,
Aye.
Matt Dunn,
Yes.
and Michelle Parker. Motion passes, and I think we're in a good place to take a break